Well, I'm thrilled to introduce Guillaume this afternoon, Guillaume Michel. Is what I find when I've been asked that rather invidious question, what's your favorite Chablis? Who's your favorite Chablis producer? I do have to say the Domaine Louis Michel features on the list, the short list. Because you think of Louis Michel as sort of prime exponent of no oak as opposed to other people using oak for making their Chablis. Louis Michel, the estate has never ever used oak. And they're an old Chablis family and going back to at least 1850, if not earlier, I think. Vineyards in prime sites of good Premier Cru and Grand Cru, and they're one of the very few owners of the tiny Grand Cru of Grenouille. So for my first book, I met Guillaume's grandfather, Louis Michel, in the 1980s. Then at the beginning of the 2000s, I'm writing my second book on Chablis, his son Jean-Loup featured. And then for the third book, the grandson Guillaume, who I think has taken the estate to new levels of excellence since his first vintage in 2007. So there's really no better person to explain to us just why Chablis is not Meursault. So Guillaume, over to you. Muted.
You hear me?
Now, yes.
Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you and for attending. I did prepare a few slides, so I will share my screen to you now. Please tell me if I'm right, because I'm not very good at sharing screens on Zoom. That's it. Does it work?
Looks good.
Great. So yeah, I'm delighted to talk to you about my family's domain, which has been producing wine, as you say, Rosemary, since 1850 in Chablis. But before that, we are a family of winemaker. Before 1850, we were based in another town named Tonnerre, which is not far from here. So in the family, actually, we make wine since 16 something, but in Chablis, it's since 1850. So I'm going to introduce you to Chablis vineyards in a few key points. And then I will present you the domain itself and our individual approach and philosophy. And then I will talk about something which is quite important to me, is that all the environmental issues that we are currently facing in Chablis, and not only in Chablis, by the way. And then I will have a look at the new challenges for Chablis wines. So Chablis is the northernmost vineyard in Burgundy. I'm pretty sure you all know this, along with Tonnerre and Joigny, who are two small vineyards that are not far from the Chablis area. And it's located about 120 kilometers north from the Côte de Nuit and about 2 hours from Paris, depending on traffic, of course. It can be 3 to 4 hours sometimes. But this location earned it the nickname of the Golden Gate of Burgundy. So if you look at the map, you can see that geographically it is disconnected from the rest of Burgundy. And actually, it's interesting to note that the closest vines to Chablis are in fact the vines of Champagne, the closest of which are about 50, 60 kilometers away from here. A little bit of history quickly, because I'm sure that you all know this by heart. Like all the vineyards in France, the history of Chablis goes back thousands of years, because actually it was the Romans who imported the vines into our region, and that was from the first century. And the Cistercian monks in the 11th, 12th century developed the wine production business here, and before the first exports made our wines known all over Europe, beyond the borders of France, actually. And this was thanks to the proximity of Paris, actually, which is easily accessible by boats along the river Seine, which is really not far from here, because actually we have the Yonne River, which is not far from Chablis. And actually the Yonne River turns into the Seine River a bit north here. So it goes directly to Paris. Then unfortunately, two factors slowed down the development of viticulture. From 1885 to 1890, the phylloxera just destroyed all the vineyards. And secondly, the loss of many Chablis residents and Chablis winemakers during the First and Second World Wars. And Chablis actually did not fully recover until the 70s. So quite not that long time ago. So I'm not going to talk about all the history of Chablis here, but I think that the key dates to remember are 1938, when the AOC were created, and the end of the 50s, when the development of frost protection techniques just saved the vineyards of Chablis and enabled them to expand to their current state. So the terroir of Chablis, just quick notes on the terroir of Chablis. Chablis wines are often, associated with seafood, shellfish and seafood. And what's interesting is that the shellfish can also be found in our soil. And it's also funny to think that this soil was formed at a time which owns its name from a small village in Dorset, Kimmeridge, which is actually better known for its bay than for its wines today. But who knows, maybe in a close future it's going to change because of all the global warming. So Chablis is in Burgundy, a region where the single variety wine is king, actually, and the king in Chablis is Chardonnay. Chardonnay, to me, is the best ambassador of the Kimmeridgian terroir, because the typicality of Chardonnay means that actually it needs a terroir to express its full complexity. I think that Chardonnay without a terroir is not that interesting, but Chardonnay with a terroir is absolutely a fantastic grape variety. And the character of Chardonnay is unique in Chablis. It's also unique in the world, I would say. And it expresses a purity and a finesse that you cannot be found elsewhere. So Chardonnay originally it's a grape variety from Burgundy, and it's a grape variety that likes to travel. So you find it everywhere in the world today. And in the past, its name in Chablis was not Chardonnay, actually, it was Beaunois, Beauunois. So which could think that's coming from bone, actually. And you find it today, you find it everywhere in the world. One other specific characteristic of Chablis is its climate. The Chablis vineyard has a particular climate that is very often described as semi-continental. So I think it's the English name. So with long, harsh winters and mostly hot summers. Actually, it's a little bit more complex. The climate of Chablis is one of the 5 main climate types as we have in France. And the scientific name actually is modified oceanic climate. But if you go not very far from Chablis, if you go to Côte d'Or, for instance, you will have another type of climate that we call the semi-continental climate. So you see, the climate in Chablis, modified oceanic climate, is really characteristic of Chablis area. It's a very small area in the country that has this climate, and not far from here, just 100 kilometers from here, it's already another climate. So the sea, the ocean, still has a slight influence here, but much less than on the coast, on the west coast of the country. And also, this climate is subject to continental influences from Eastern Europe. So we are in the middle of 2 big influences. So a little bit of the sea coming from the west and the continental from the east. So here in Chablis, we have a bit less rain than on the west. The winter are quite harsher than on the west. This is because of the east influence. And the summer are much hotter than in the areas with oceanic climates. And if you look at the figures, the statistic, actually, the rainfall in Chablis is between 650 and 700 millimeters of water. September is usually fine, dry, and sunny, with cool night temperature that can drop down to 5 degrees, and with a big contrast with the day temperature in September that can still be quite warm, more 25 degrees or more, which is still the summer temperature that we can reach during the day. So I just wanted to focus a little bit on spring frost, which is a big characteristic of the Chablis vineyards. The growers in Chablis have had to learn to deal with it, and that was back in the 50s, thanks to the frost protection in the 15s. That's just saved the Chablis wines, as I said earlier. Traditionally, they were using small fire heaters to protect against frost. They're working with oil, actually, with all a network of oil. And it all started in 1958-59, actually. Today, we use less and less this system. We prefer to use what we call frost candles. Frost candles basically are, you can imagine it like a big candle, about 8 liters, and that we use and that you can burn. And to give you an idea, you have to put 400 of them per hectare to protect the vineyards. And thanks to that, we can keep the temperature around 0 degrees when it's cold. And also we use sprinklers, actually, that keep the bud at a temperature of 0 degrees. And today we have new techniques such as heating wires that allows us to protect the buds. And heating wires is something that is really interesting. That because of the frost that we had last year and 2 years ago, we start to develop more and more the protection with heating wires. And it's quite very simple. The idea is to have a wire that will run along the vineyards and very close to the bud, actually. And the idea is because of electricity, and it will the wires will get a bit warm, and it will protect an area just around the wire, about 5 to 10 centimeters around the wire, and that's enough actually to protect the buds from frost. It's very interesting also because once it's installed, you have nothing to do. You don't have to install the candles. You don't have to deal about that, and you can even stay in bed, because of course you can imagine it can be a kind of automatic system that we just turn on with when the temperature goes down. And of course, in terms of environments, it's also very interesting because you do not burn any oil. Also, we see the development today of wind turbines, heated wind turbines that are being installed over a large portion of the vineyards. It's right now, the installation is right now, and it will be probably efficient next year. And I'm talking about something about 50 wind turbines that are installed in the Maligny area, which is a bit north of the old Chablis terroir, and that can be quite efficient as well. But this kind of heat turbines, you cannot install it everywhere, unfortunately, because the land needs to be quite flat for it to be efficient. If you have a lot of valleys, hills and valleys, it is not as efficient as candles or heating wires. So now the domain. So the domain currently has 25 hectares of vines, all located in the historic terroir of Chablis, the same one that was planted by the Romans, actually. And because we are an old family, we are lucky to have all our vineyards located in the historical terroir of Chablis, the one that you can see in the black circle that I made on the map. The majority of our wines are Premier and Grand Cru. They make up 65% of our production. But we also have Petit Chablis vineyards that are located behind the hill of Valmure, as well as Chablis AC vineyards that comes mainly from the left bank of the river, because you know that in Chablis we talk about the right bank and the left bank. The Chablis vineyard is separated into two by the river Serein that you can see on the map. And we talk about the right bank and the left bank. So our Chablis mainly comes from the left bank, and more especially between the valleys of Vaillon and Montmain. So today we produce 150,000 bottles per year when it's a normal vintage. So that was not the case since 2018 actually. We've been exporting our wines to England. England was our first export country. We started to work in England in 1960, and starting to work with a company named OW Lub. And currently we export more than 80% of our production to more than 40 countries from all the continents, from the United States to Oceania, Australia, and Asia. So 80% of our production exports. This is the reason why we export a lot is mainly an historical reason, because we did start bottling our own bottle back in the 30s. And so, as you can imagine, the first importer, roughly after the World War II, when they arrived in Chablis looking for some wine, they were looking for some winemakers that were able to provide them with bottles. And at this time, actually, the main market, the majority of winemakers here were selling their wines in bulk. But that was not the case at the estate. So the fact that we were able to provide with bottle was the beginning of the big exports. And now we continue like that. So our philosophy has always been very clear. What we like to make is fine, fresh, clean, and precise Chablis. And above all, we want to make Chablis that respects all their various terroirs of origin. The Chablis terroir is rich in many facets, and what we really want to do is to highlight this diversity. And with that in mind, each process, each element of vinification sticks to highlight the natural expression of of our terroirs, and above all, not to impress any external influence on the wine. So we really want the terroir. We really want to let the terroir talk in the glass, and I think that any of our influence as a winemaker, actually, we really want to have it as more discreet as possible. So this philosophy begins in the vineyards. If you want to make terroir wine, you need to respect the life in the soil. You need to encourage biodiversity. You need to limit yields, and actually this translates into mechanical and non-chemical weeding, for instance, and quite very strict viticultural practices, and special attention paid to the vines. At the domain, 80% of the staff works in the vineyards, and only in the vineyards, because it's in the vineyards that you make your wine. And very often say this. While there is a lot of heavy work to be done in the vineyards, at the time of the harvest, I consider that 90% of the work is done. The rest in the winery is follow up and control. That's all. But it's done by 90% once you harvest, and that's very important, I think, especially if you want to make terroir driven wines. So in the winery, as I just said, all we do is just monitoring and control. We ban any input that could go against the expression of the terroir. No added yeasts. We work with spontaneous fermentations by only using native yeast that are naturally present in the cellars and on the berries. The malolactic fermentation is also done spontaneously without any inputs, and we do not do any chilling of the wines and so on. So the only thing we do is when necessary is just fining the wines using bentonite, which is totally neutral, and that's the only intrant that we could use to make our wine. So our vinification process is quite long. It's gentler, longer than in some other estates, but I'm not in a hurry. I think you need time to make your wine, and very important is not to hurry, and let the nature and let the wine make by itself, actually. So we believe that respecting the terroir means vinifying only in tanks. Tanks are neutral. They have no impact on the wine. So they respect all the variations in the terroir. The wines, of course, can sometimes show a little bit of reduction, but this mineral reduction is specific to Chablis, and is actually a hallmark of our terroir. So now we did start the use of a stainless steel tank that was 50 years ago. It's my grandfather who decided to totally stop using oak barrel and start vinifying in tank. And at this time, he was one of the only to switch completely to tank vinification. And the characteristic when he decided to do that is that he did that for all the wines, not only the Petit Chablis and the Chablis, and maybe continuing using oak barrels for the Premier and the Grand Cru. He decided to move on all the wines, and that was really quite unique at this time. So that's why in a lot of people's mind, when you say Louis Michel, people think when Chablis connoisseur, when they hear Louis Michel, they think, yeah, tank Chablis. And it's still the case today after 50 years. So now the new challenges that we have. I think now we are living in quite a very interesting time in terms of viticulture. In recent years, our working environment has changed a lot. And of course, Chablis is in the same situation. We have become aware that the growing method that we are using in the past must change. Viticulture in the 80s was about weeding chemically and using too many synthetic products. Of course, it's important to not to accuse our predecessor of malpractice too quickly, because they had at this time their own constraints, and they were working in a different context. But now we are facing new and increasingly demanding consumers looking for healthy products, and wine is at the forefront, of course. And this phenomenon, I'm sure you notice, has accelerated in recent years, and particularly among young growers. And they are right. I think it is our responsibility to clean up our acts. So not forget that wine growers are the biggest users of chemical phytosanitary products, and so that's very important to have this in mind. And of course, now almost everyone agrees on this. The climate is changing, and the climate is changing very quickly. So those two elements are, for me, the very big new challenges of the 21st century. So I'm talking about my generation, and I'm talking, of course, about the next generation. So how should our domain evolve given this observation? Do we have the right approach in the vineyards management today? Are we making the right vinification choices? Those are a lot of questions that we are asking ourselves every day, actually. At the domain, we choose to gradually modify the products we use by eliminating CMR products. So CMR means carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic, I think, something like that. So it's kind of a poison products, they say it like that, in order to protect our employees and the environments. We used to use only biocontrol products, and then going on to use only organic products. So it was really a gradually change. And we found that our wines were finer, but above all, more representative of the terroir, which were better defined. And you know that for me, it's very important. So finally, the application for organic approval was granted in 2019 vintage. And that's for me very important in the vineyards. So we grow organically now, and the certification, it's quite a long process. So the certification will be official next year, I think, if I remember well. And in the winery, actually, nothing has changed, because our practices have always been compatible with the organic viticulture requirements. Climate change. So as I said, global warming affects everyone. And as you can imagine, because we work with nature, we are, as a wine grower, we are on the front line, and among wine growers, I think everybody agrees that the climate change is changing. You won't find any wine grower saying that there is no global changing. Of course, we could talk about this issue and its consequences for days, but the most visible facts for the moment are the following. The winters are shorter and milder, and quite logically, bud break occurs earlier on the vines, which makes them sensitive to night frost earlier in the year. Of course, global warming has not eliminated natural nocturnal frost. That would be too easy. But things are actually much worse, in fact, because that's premature bud break makes the vines sensitive to the first frost in April, known as black frost. And those frosts are more extensive and colder than those in May, what we call the white frost. So my grandfather did not have to worry about frost in April, because at this time the vines were still in their winter dormancy phase, so they were not sensitive to it. But today is different. Our vineyards are sensitive to April frost, and that was the fact in 2020, 21, and even this year in 22, we had to face with frost in April that were quite severe, but hopefully not with too much damages. Secondly, from the month of May now, it's no longer rare to observe quite violent climatic accidents, in particular hail, which can completely destroy all of part of the harvest. And right now, even today, we are in France. It's quite of a storm alert in the country, mainly in the southwest, but here in Chablis as well, the weather forecast decided to put a kind of alert, storm alert in Chablis area. And the third thing about the global warming is that summers are drier and hotter. This completely changes how the grapes ripe. They are now reaching ripeness levels that are totally different from those that were recorded by my grandfather, for instance. So while my grandfather made wines with grapes harvested barely ripe in October, we are now working with raw materials harvested at full ripeness, but 3 to 4 weeks earlier. And even more earlier, because, for example, this year in 22, the flower is now finished, and so we expect to start harvesting the very early September, or even maybe the last week of August. So there is no longer any need to chaptalize. We naturally have an improved sugar acidity balance. The wine's acidity, of course, has dropped a little bit, which makes them more, I think, approachable when young, but which does not affect their typicality, I think, in any way. We can already see it happening. Global warming is bringing also, and that's quite important, new vine disease in the vineyards. Of course, today there are not a lot of studies on this issue, but we are seeing more of it, and we can see it every day that those new diseases. For example, as I said, our summer are very dry, and this contributes to the development of wood disease, such as ESCA, for instance, which develops much faster in dry weather. Also, the flavescence dorée. So I don't know the name in English of that disease, but it's quite a big issue, and it's originally mainly found in the south of France. This disease is moving north and is now affecting the southern parts of Burgundy. So you can be sure that it will continue to go up with global warming, and it's moving. The insect that carry this disease is moving to the north and is approaching Chablis area. The bois noir, also another disease transmitted by insects, has also become more and more visible in Chablis recently. So you see that in the three cases, the rootstock die prematurely and must be replaced. The vines also die prematurely and must be replaced. That means repercussion of production, as you can imagine, and but also on vineyard management, because replacing dead vines every year after the harvest has become actually an important part, a key part of our work, and we need people and time, of course, to take care of this. So as you see, we start to see now all the consequences of the global warming and the climate change in our everyday work, actually in the vineyards. So how are the wines now affected by this global warming? Should we change what we do in the cellar? How the grapes harvested in a different ripeness and on different dates behave? I just wanted to give you two recent examples. For example, the 2017 vintage was harvested early. At the domain, we started on September 6th, and it was, as you can imagine, full ripeness. And I'm pretty sure that no one has found lack of freshness in that vintage. The 18 vintage, which is a very solar vintage, was harvested at the same date. At the domain, we started on September 7th, okay, one day later. Initially, the wines of 2018 were very strongly influenced by this solar vintage. It was quite difficult to recognize all the individual terroirs, but now, after a few years in the bottles, the vintage effect is fading out, the terroir is rising up, and the wines are improving in finesse and purity. And to me, that's a true sign that Chablis is a great terroir and that is not actually suffering for global warming. Another example is the 2006 vintage. It is also, to me, a good example of this. And to me, because we are talking about consequential vinification, tanks are in fact ideal containers. They help us to preserve freshness in the wines. So we are definitely not making any changes here. And thanks to our tanks, we are not even reconsidering any kind of acidification because this is because I'm saying that because this is something you clearly hear more and more about, acidification of the wine. But to me, I don't believe in acidification, because even if acidity is tending to be a bit lower than it was back in the 70s or the 80s, I think that the freshness and the tension of Chablis is still very very clear. And that's another proof of the importance of terroir actually in the wine. So, you know, for all that reason, I think that today, as we could say that we make, with global warming, we make better wines, but less volume, that would be this. And very often I say that I'm the lucky generation, actually, because we have now, I think today, everything we need to make wonderful wines, and but only hoping that they are not destroyed by frost or hail. So now the question is how this situation is going to evolve. I think that nobody really knows. We clearly see that the evolution is quite quick, and it's maybe a bit quicker than expected. But to me, there are still many things many avenues, things to explore actually. So the solution for the future, this is something that on which we have a lot to do. In Chablis, we still only use Chardonnay, of course. It's the king grape, as I said earlier, and in our land. And by using rootstock and various clones, we can fight against some of the ravages brought by global warming. For example, right now we use more and more rootstock that are tolerant to drought. Name is the scientific name of this rootstock. It's 5BB, for example. More and more used because it resists more to drought. And so I think that before starting to switch variety and introduce new grape variety, it would be better to look for strains amongst existing or previously used plants. So some strain that will resist to climate change. There are a lot of strains with a lot of variety, diversity of characteristic. So I think that the research is already exploiting this diversity. And today we have the possibility to use a lot of strains that are more adapted to a local situation. And probably in the future, it will continue to have more and more possibilities, well, I hope. And so also the diversity is interesting because those strains can adapt to climate change. At the domain, we use only plants from massal selection, actually. But we are really looking at all these new characteristics and new strains. And I'm not against trying to, as an experiment, trying to use one of them and see how it will work with the new environmental context, actually. So we'll see that. And in Chablis, there is a great diversity of location with different altitude aspect and so on. And so possibly we can have a new condition and new ways of places that we could plant, new places in which you can plant vines to fight against global warming. For instance, use more north, maybe all the north-facing parts of the valleys maybe are going to be more and more interesting in the future. There are some sectors that today are non-productive, but that maybe they will get more and more interest in the future. But changing all of this, as you can imagine, it means changing all the AOC laws in France, and those laws in France are sacred. So this is something that is going to move very, very, very slowly. Also, we think maybe we may consider changing our farming practices, such as irrigation, which is today forbidden. So this is quite a sacred subject here, and because also it's very linked to the notion of terroir. And the notion of terroir here is very important. And so in the short term, this is something that we cannot consider. But maybe if the global warming accelerates a lot and forces us to do so, we can imagine that maybe it will be a solution in the future. But for the moment, you know, it's something on which we try to move very, very, very slowly. So you see that I think that as a conclusion, we are in Chablis, and this is the same for all the majority of wine producing region in France. We are really in the middle of a very important challenge. I think the 21st century is going to be the century of new challenges, and it is just the beginning. We still have a lot of to do. We still have a lot of solutions to discover, and trying to. The aim, of course, will be to make wines that are always the best wine as possible, and of course that are wines that will with the best that will translate the expression of the terroir and the richness and the diversity and the characteristic of the terroir in Chablis in the future. And I'm quite confident that Chablis terroir in the future will still be very unique and a very unique terroir, and Chablis will remain and continue to be a quite unique wines in the future. Well, I hope, and we'll do our best so that we continue to enjoy Chablis wines in the future. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Guillaume. That was really informative, and it sparked some great questions in the chat. I wonder if, Patricia, you had a number of specifically technical questions, and both viticultural and enological. Would you like to unmute yourself and chat with Guillaume about those?
Sure. I had a couple questions when you were talking about installing the heating wires, and I wondered down to what temperature does that actually work to keep the buds
today
zero?
Today, we thanks to the electric wire, we realized that the temperature can go down to -5, 6,
Okay.
and it's still efficient.
Thank you.
Of course, if the temperature goes below that, it will be much less efficient, but it will be the same for candles or smudge pots. The only protection that will remain efficient in lower temperature maybe would be the water spraying with the sprinklers.
Thanks.
But what's important with electric wires, it's not only the fact that it will protect the buds, it's also the fact that the fact that there is this constant heating on the wire, because the idea when you have electric wire to protect your vineyards, the idea is to start it quite early in the night, much when the temperature are still positive. But if the forecast says that it's going to be a frost, ideally if the forecast says it's going to be a frosty night, you turn on your wires at 8, 9 p.m. when it's still positive, because the idea is also to reheat the sap of the vines, and so the vines it help the vine to fight, to protect herself against the frost.
Really helpful. Thank you.
Guillaume, perhaps you'd like to stop.
To
I'm sorry, may I just, Guillaume, would you please stop sharing your screen, because then we can see.
Yeah, sure.
People will be able to see you a little bit better. Thank you. Sorry, Patricia, didn't mean to interrupt. Please proceed.
No, I was just going to say that Amanda had a question related to frost protection, and that one probably should be answered now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Guillaume. That was super interesting. I wanted to ask who was funding the wind turbines?
Funding?
Yeah, who's paying for them?
Oh, it's all the winemakers that are concerned by the protection. They make it's a group of winemakers, what we call a CUMA in France, actually. So they group all of each other and they invest, and probably also you have a lot of subvention from the government to help to any protection against frost. There are some subventions help the winemakers, because the government realized that it prefers to help winemakers to protect against frost rather than give money after a disaster like 2021 harvest.
Of course, thank you. And will any of your vineyards be protected, hopefully, by these turbines?
No, unfortunately, we don't, because all our vineyards are not located in that area.
Okay.
The area needs to be quite flat and with no hills and valleys. Otherwise, the wind, the turbines doesn't work.
Okay, thank you.
Patricia, you had some additional questions about vinification, about whether you need to warm the cellar for ML, a variety of other questions. Would you like to ask those?
Sure, I'll jump back in. Sorry.
Thank you.
It's
great.
sort of the things I have an extreme interest in. This one's fairly simple, but do you have to heat your cellars to initiate malolactic conversion?
Yeah.
And then I had a question about when it starts and when it finishes.
So it's the only thing we do in the winery is controlling the temperature. So when the fermentation starts naturally, so first of all, after the harvest, I cool down the musts, because I like when the fermentation starts when the wines are around 13-14 degrees Celsius. Then it will, with the alcoholic fermentation, then it will heat naturally. And then the thermal regulation will limit the heat so that it's not more than 18-19 degrees Celsius. And then when the malolactic will start spontaneously, we need to heat the wines, because malolactic is more efficient when it's around 20-21 degrees Celsius. So I switch the thermo controller from cold to hot, and to keep in a hot temperature. And when it happens, when you work with natural yeast, it's not the same vinification as when you work with selected yeast. You know, with selected yeast is you make vinification by the book. First, you inoculate with yeast, and we have a kind of let's say 2 weeks fermentation. Then you inoculate with bacteria. Then you have your malolactic. With natural yeast, it will start with the alcoholic fermentation. It can last 2 months, very slow. And then what happens very often is that the malolactic takes place while the alcoholic is not totally finished. And then when the malolactic is done, it's the alcoholic fermentation that starts again, probably with another species of yeast, and that will finish the alcoholic fermentation. So the process is about both alcoholic and malolactic. The process is about 3 months fermentation.
Thank you. I'm still asking questions.
Well, Patricia, I have a follow-up question this might be good, because we're actually walking from the vineyard to the bottle. Guillaume, you mentioned reduction, and that Chablis and Chardonnay it's a characteristic really of the wine in some ways. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about reductive winemaking, and obviously that really factors into your choice not to use barrel, etc. So could you just say a few more words about that, that philosophy?
Yeah. So the reductive is a way to vinify the wine. So as a winemaker, I prefer reduction to oxidation, as you can imagine. So reduction is quite a good sign. But the idea, and also the good thing with reduction is that to limit the reduction, it's quite easy. You just need to air the wines. And so, but me, what I like, and that's my personal taste, I also like the wines of Chablis when they have a very slight reduction characteristic, what we like to call the mineral reduction in Chablis. And this is something that happens quite often in the tank, actually, because the tank is a very oxygen-free, as you can imagine. It's an oxygen-free container environments. So naturally, the wine will start to reduce a little bit. And so the idea is just to check and to control regularly. And if it's too much in terms of reduction, you just need to air the wine. So airing a wine is just moving the wine from one tank to the other. That's all mainly that we do. But the idea is always to keep a kind of level of this kind of austerity in the wine that makes the characteristic of Chablis.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Patricia, or anyone else have a question about the winemaking process that they'd like to jump in?
I was sort of curious about what sort of levels, SO2 levels, are there total or free that you have generally when you bottle?
When we bottle, it's about it's about 80. The level of SO2 is around 80 total, and free it's about 30, depending on the wine. So it can be a bit more, 30, 37 when dealing with the Grand Cru, for instance. But the Petit Chablis and the Chablis, that are wines that are made to be drunk a bit younger, let's say, it will be more around 30. But also it can depend on the vintage. You know, you have some vintages that consume much more SO2 than the others. So this is something that you check during the maturing on the wines in tank. So you check, for example, the 19 vintage is a vintage that I think consumes quite a lot of SO2 compared to some other vintage. So when you have that, when you adjust the SO2 at the bottling, you have to have this in mind and be careful of what you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone else like to chime in? Was there any other questions for Guillaume? Thank you very much. Rosemary, would you like to say a few concluding words, or Liz?
Can I just ask one last one, which is a difficult one perhaps. Guillaume, thank you very much. Are you finding with these much hotter summers that there is any change in the kind of ripening differences you would expect to find between Petit Chablis, Chablis, Premier Cru, Grand Cru? Is the old order in any danger of being overturned?
So the difference of ripening depending on the style of wine, the location of the wines.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, the Grand Cru are the end of the maturation of the grapes in the vineyard is different, and definitely the Grand Cru are ripening quicker than they used to. Back in the days when we harvested, we used to harvest the Grand Cru roughly at mid-harvest, 2/3 of harvest in time. Right now, it's not rare that we start with the Grand Cru because they ripe earlier. Yeah, but also we realize that now overall the ripeness. Now with the ripeness overall, everything is ripe roughly at the same time. So we did change our way of harvest. We organize ourselves to harvest quicker than we used to. 20 years ago, the harvest lasts for, let's say, between 12 and 13 days. It was the time of the harvest. Now in about 1 week, it's done, because the idea is to avoid overripe grapes. So I think that I think that the ripeness of the grapes is more interesting than back in the 70s. But we have to be careful of not having overripe grapes, because the risk of overripe is higher.
Wrap. It's great to have your presentation, Guillaume. I learned a tremendous amount. I love Chablis, had some last night, as I mentioned. And very insightful, very instructive. Rosemary or Liz, would you like to say any final remarks?
Well, I think listening to Guillaume, I'm planning to have some Chablis this evening. Guillaume,
okay,
thank
good.
you. That was fascinating. I mean, it almost made up for not being able to go to Chablis for the last 2 or 3 years, and lovely to have an up-to-date overview of sort of some of your current challenges. And I also realized, to my shame, I've been wrong on the climate of Chablis in 3 books, writing it as up as semi-continental. I now remember modified oceanic climate. So thank you for that. and
That's
say
it.
thank you for a great insight into what's happening to Chablis today. And I hope to get back soon.